Hi, I'm John Moulis, and welcome back to my series of videos about my time at the Department of Finance in Canberra and the bullying and harassment and psychological torture that I encountered when I was there. Now, the beginning of 1985 was a very bad period for me personally and for the whole country and everything in particular. I mean, life in Australia just turned nasty. This AIDS hysteria and all of that had created this nastiness in the country. Violent crime escalated during that period. It was just terrible. And at home, I was really depressed, and I just came back. My head was spinning. It was just this terrible realisation that I had wasted my life up until then. That I was in a city that I hated, Canberra, having to deal with politicians and public servants who I hated. I mean, having to deal with terrible climate. And look, and I was like a stunned mullet for about 5 months at the beginning of 1985, just wondering what I was going to do, because I was 25 years old, I was halfway to 30, I was entering middle age. At that stage, 25 years old was back then it was, life ends at 30 and that sort of thing, and I faced a dilemma. I thought, things were getting worse and worse at work, and thinking, and I was refusing to resign, and all the time I refused to resign, the campaign against me was getting worse. And I thought, how much more of this can I take? Am I going to have another 40 years of this? How could I cope with that until retirement age? And I didn't have any skills. I couldn't do anything else. And, the other things that I talked about in the last video, the other talents that I had, I could leave the public service and go into those fields, but those fields were risky. There was no guarantee that I would get employment in those other fields to pay off the loan for the holidays. And I was already, I think I was $4,000 in arrears at that stage, and just there seemed to be no way out, and I did some very deep thinking during that time, and because of that, I was acting funny. The situation at home became really bad as well. Screaming, yelling matches every night. My father just, he had a silent heart attack at the end of 1984, and he'd just become so volatile, and he was told, he and my mother were told to give up smoking, and they were there giving, so they were really testy because of that, having to give up smoking, and they just took it out on me, and just night after night, these screaming matches. And I'd have to get on the bus the following morning where I lived, and everybody on the bus was there looking at me, staring at me, because they'd all heard what had happened the previous night. Nobody had phoned the police or anything. It was obvious that and I just had to put up, and I had to go there to work and put up with all the shit at work. Everything was just closing in on me. It was just, and I reacted. By this stage, my psychological condition was getting worse and worse. It was really starting to wear me down, everything. Nothing was improving, it was getting worse, and everything. And that was the period, and my appearance started getting worse and worse. The way I looked, the way I acted, I refer to it as my going to seed period. I just didn't give a stuff anymore about anything. That, I knew that the cards were all stacked against me at work, that I had no future, that there was no prospect of improvement, that things were just going downhill. And my appearance reflected that. I mean, I grew a long bushy beard like Ned Kelly. I mean, I grew my hair, I had long hair. I looked like a tramp. I mean, men who have beards are tramps. They look like tramps, they look slovenly and unappealing. And that's how I looked. And it was during that dreadful Rambo period when the whole Rambo thing had taken hold, and the whole Vietnam veterans thing. And I got caught up in all of that. I used to wear, and this is something that hasn't been documented very much about that period in the 1980s, from 1985 through to about 1992, was that was the Rambo period. And back then you had army surplus stores, disposal stores, where you could buy camouflage gear and all that sort of thing. And you used to see guys walking around the streets with camouflage gear on and car keys and army surplus. Of course, that was all knocked on the head by September 11th. The military camouflage is top secret and all that, and they don't sell it to the public at all now. But back then you could go into just about every shopping centre had an army surplus store. I mean, at Woden Plaza in Canberra, it was Damic Disposals. You used to buy the rucksacks there. You'd buy shirts with paratrooper stripes on it. The rankings were still on the shirts. And you'd buy all of this stuff and walk around, and I was walking around in that stuff, and I used to wear an Akubra, and I used to wear flannelette shirts, and I used to go into work like that. And I suppose that maybe a lot of these more hysterical complaints, I may have contributed to the escalation in those complaints and the nature of those complaints, because I looked terrible. I look at the photos of me back then and I just looked awful. I just looked disgusting. And it wasn't, and I noticed when I went back and saw my files that the tenor of the complaints and the tone of the complaints started getting more and more personal, more and more cutting, just more and more savage towards me as a person. And I read my replies to those complaints, and they were becoming more and more hysterical and unbalanced, my responses, and it reflected my psychological condition at the time, and my psychological and psychiatric condition and physiological condition at the time. And it was really awful. And what had happened is that I was in a dilemma. I mean, I couldn't continue. I was reaching the end of the line. I started boycotting the department. I'd get into work at 8:30 in the morning, and Jim Tuckerman, the supervisor of the print room, would start up the rank Xerox 9400 with the loud noise and that, and the printing machines would start up there with all of this noise, and I just walked out. I used to walk out at about 9:15 when the press clippings came in for photocopying. I used to walk out, and I used to walk over to the National Library just to get away from the place, because I couldn't stand being there. It was claustrophobic. It was just, and I used to go over to the National Library and that, and the complaints were rolling in and all of that. And I came back one day from the National Library, and Jim Tuckerman, my supervisor, the notorious crawler, said to me, "How was the National Library?" And I didn't know how to react. I said, "Oh, it's all right." And he said to me, "Well, the bosses saw you walking over, And I thought, oh, God, will I ever be free of this? It was Big Brother looking at me all the time. These bosses staring at me and having me under the microscope all the time like some specimen on a Petri dish. It was just incredible. And you know, by August 1985, there were 4 or 5 different complaints out against me at the same time. They were all being investigated, all were taken seriously as usual, and I knew that this so-called investigation was just a rubber stamp, that they'd all be found against me. It was just oppressive. You know, I think that on one day I was called into the director's office 3 separate times to answer complaints that had come in. And I thought, yeah, look, I can't put up with this anymore. What happened is that I didn't come in one morning, and I phoned them up, and this was budget time in the Department of Finance, which was the busiest time out. You know, I was looking at that and thinking, you know, how am I going to cope with the pressure of budget week, having these complaints out against me, 4 or 5 separate complaints out against me at the same time, and so I just, what happened is I went to the credit union, I got another loan for about $1,000. I booked a trip up to Byron Bay for that week, for that budget week, just to get away from the place, just, you know, and my strategy, I thought, if I get away from the place for a week, that should be a circuit breaker, that it'll stall the momentum of complaints. I could come back and they would have gotten out of the habit of complaining about me. But, you know, I didn't know that during that week I was away, budget week, another complaint had gone in about me. I mean, it was just never ending. I came back and it was just the same old thing. It was just psychological torture, you know, and I was cracking up. I was cracking up. And the fact that the bosses, nobody saw me cracking up, nobody took any action. I mean, if it was anywhere else, you know, the boss would have seen it and he would have recommended a psychiatrist, some sort of professional help, you know, and they had seen me, my behaviour and that. I mean, they should have known that I was, you know, that there was something wrong with me, that I was mentally disabled, you know, because I couldn't cope with the pressure, I couldn't interact with other people properly on a business level. I mean, but they just let it continue. They just let me deteriorate, and just, I mean, I was dying mentally before their eyes. I mean, it was, oh, look, it just kept on, and the complaints against me were continuing, and more complaints went in about me, just more and more complaints. And so, you know, in September, I think it would have been October 1985, I was called into the director's office again. And I thought, look, it's on again. And then the director, I think it might have been Galloway, I'm not really sure, they said to me that there were positions open in the National Film and Sound Archive, that their staff, of course that was during the RSI epidemic, repetition strain injury epidemic, and their staff were away on RSI, and they said, would you like to go over to National Film and Sound Archive to transfer over there? And I thought, great, you know, I'll go over there, I'll be away from finance and I'll have a fresh start and all of that. But I didn't realise it at the time that this was stage 2 of the strategy to get rid of me out of the public service. I mean, I thought it was an exciting new opportunity in another department where I'd have a fresh start and that. But I went over there, and the problems that I had in finance followed me over there, because like I said, I was really fragile psychologically. I was acting funny and all of that. And the staff at the National Film and Sound Archive turned against me. They froze me out and everything, and problems arose there with the way I dealt with staff and that, and the incredible pressure that I was still under. Because what had happened is that while I was out of the Department of Finance, Galloway decided to resurrect an old complaint against me, a complaint which had already been resolved against me. He decided to revive that and charge me under the Public Service Act, and he had another complaint which was still outstanding against me when I went over to the National Film and Sound Archive, and he charged me under that one again, under the Public Service Act for disgraceful and improper conduct again. And at the same time, he abolished my position at the Department of Finance. You know, the position in the print room doing the photocopying, that was abolished. So I got a phone call. I was called into the supervisor there at National Film and Sound Archive, the boss there. I think his name was Waghorn. And, I was told that I was no good and everything. And I had a bit of a fight with him. I said, why did all of the staff freeze me out? Why did they all treat me like garbage? And you know what he said? He said, because they find you offensive. They find you offensive. So that was justification for the treatment I received there. I told him to get stuffed and that, and he said, look, he said, go back to finance now. So I was kicked out of that place, but I couldn't go back to finance. I mean, I phoned up finance and they said, no, you come back on Monday, and that was a Friday. I was told I was going back to finance, on the following Monday. So anyway, I got back to finance on the Monday. My position had been abolished. I had to be in there. What happened, I was sitting in estimates and accounts again, folding file covers. That was how they amused me. And then I was called into the director's office, and I was told about the charges that were going ahead against me and everything like that. And so anyway, I came back the next day. I was called into the director's office again, and I saw on his, I think it was the assistant secretary this time, was in there in the director's office with him. The director was a fella named John Walsh, who I hated. I didn't get along with him at all. He was really nasty, really hard-nosed. He was the epitome of the new managerialism which they were putting into the public service at that time. But anyway, I noticed this piece of paper on the desk. It said, John Moulis, notice of suspension. And at that stage, I didn't know what suspension was. I mean, I thought suspension meant sacking, that I would be sacked, that they were calling me in there and I was going to be sacked on the spot, but anyway, it didn't mean that. It meant that they had decided that I was too much of a disruptive influence to stay in the department. So I was still on the payroll, I was still an officer of the Department of Finance, but I was effectively kicked out. That was it. I was kicked out, and I was suspended as of 12 noon that day, or 12:30 close of business that day it was, that's right. So I was suspended from the Department of Finance. Anyway, and that opened a whole new door. It wasn't as bad as I thought. In fact, it was very good because I was away from the Department of Finance. Anyway, this is about to run out, so I'll say goodbye and come back for the next exciting episode.